All right, welcome to the narrated notes of natural selection. There is a time limit on these recordings, so there will be a part one and part two. But natural selection is something we've been looking at all along. You know, what causes changes and what causes the variety in our population that is then, produces this vast biodiversity that we have that we kind of talked about last week. So we're going to start with the definition. And natural selection is the process in which organisms better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. And the nice thing with the video is that you can pause. So I'm going to go at kind of a normal pace, but you can pause and write notes down as needed. So we'll break down this definition a little bit. So the process in which organisms better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. So a process, so something is happening to organisms that have adaptations that fit their environment. So things that, can run faster, blend in better, or with humans, walk upright. All these things fit our environment or our niche, the place that we fit very well. And then the ones that survive tend to have more offspring. If you think about animal dying, they're not going to be able to reproduce. So as animals survive, they can have more babies. This little chart is kind of a breakdown of this definition, and it goes a little bit more in detail, but you start with this gray. There's some mutation occurred that causes variation, and this variation could fit the environment or it could not, so it could be good or bad. In the case of this white circle, it was bad. It didn't fit the environment. It was selected against. So these animals are no longer surviving and no longer producing more offspring. Whereas these darker color ones survive, and then it turns out being even darker helps survive even better. So these ones do not continue reproducing, but the darker ones do. And this favorable mutation that's been passed on over generations has allowed them to survive and reproduce. So our population changed from this light gray frequency or trait to this ending up with a darker gray trait. So over time, evolution occurs to populations. Mutations happen and it causes variation, but it does not, it's not evolution until the whole population changes. It's individual change isn't really anything. It's just a small change in the grand scheme of things. So for this slide, I'd like you to pause and look back at the definition of natural selection and just think about which organism is better adapted and more likely to survive. So go ahead and pause. All right, so now you're playing again. We have these green and brown beetles, so there's variation in our population. So one of these traits could be better fit for the environment. Turns out that being darker colored is the better fit because the bird, some type of finch, I think, is eating the green beetles, and all you're left with at the end is mostly brown beetles. So we're going to end up with brown beetles because the brown trait is what's passed on. The green ones are being eaten, so they're not passing on being green. And we'll get into next semester why there would still be some green beetles left, even if they're all eaten. But that's kind of a later conversation that has to do with the way DNA works. So as we look at this picture, I just want to help clear up an idea here, and this kind of goes with like the peppered moth and the rock pocket mouse. These beetles did not choose their color. It just, through mutation, it kind of originated, being a little bit darker than whatever the original beetle looked like. So maybe if it was the green beetle originally, maybe one was born kind of a really dark green. Then that dark green one survived and passed on being dark green, and it just changed over time to being this more brown beetle. But it's not the tree color that determined the color of directly anyway, the color of the beetle. It's more the pressure from the birds. So these birds can see the green ones and eat them easier or more easily. And it just so happened that, as the color change and mutation, it ended up being closely looking like the tree. So it's not the background that determined the color. It was the predator and this camouflage that kind of developed over time, just through mutation and change, that they ended up being brown. A term we're going to use quite a bit is trait and adaptation, and I kind of go in between using them. But that's a structure, function, or behavior by which a species or individual improves its chance of survival in a specific environment, and this is not a conscious choice. So, for example, we have a frog and our moth, and we've been using the camouflage one quite a bit. This adaptation that's arisen over time helps them survive in a specific environment. So this works against this type of tree, but if we move this moth to the desert, it's not going to blend into a cactus very well. So it is a specific environment that this adaptation works in. When we look at the frog, just for examples that aren't camouflage, things like nocturnal vision, so being able to see at night. They have extra photoreceptors, extra big pupils. All these things are changed over time that allowed them to be more suited for living at night. So where do these adaptations come from? We have variation. Again, we've talked quite a bit about variation, but species have variation, and this is caused by mutation or sexual reproduction. We get into both of these a little bit more later on, but they're just differences in our DNA that make us look a little bit different. So we have two examples. We have these flowers. Some are tall, some are short. And I know it could look like they're still growing, but these are meant to be adult flowers. So some are tall, some are short, just like in our population. Some people are taller, some people are shorter. We have that variation. This is all the same species of orchid, but all the different ways that it can look. So we have, very open and light colored to very kind of squished and darker colored. And then kind of with the examples we've been using, maybe pollinators prefer a more smaller landing pad, or this looks more, attractive to them. Maybe it suggests that it has more nectar, or this color is more appealing. So this one becomes more favorable and passes on its genes more often through seeds, and plants pass on genes like humans do. We'll see more orchids that look like this, as opposed to this one. Maybe they no longer like this color. They don't like it as much as this bottom color. This one's not going to be pollinated as much and not going to pass on its genes as often. We're going to see a population shift to this color. We're going to do one more slide and then we'll move on to part 2, just so we don't run out of time. And this one you don't have to take notes on, but this is what my notes look like when I wrote that down. So I wrote down the definition. To help me understand the definition, I also drew a picture, and I labeled that picture, because if you just write this and then draw this picture, maybe you just thought you were doodling flowers, maybe you don't remember the point. But I wrote, varying height and flower shape. Oh yeah, so there's variation in a population. So these are things that you can be adding to your notes to help you remember things and for later on, because as we move on, you might not remember quite as well, but when you go to study, things like this will help. This is the end of part 1, and I will move on to part 2 very shortly.